Okay. All right, so we're going to continue through the Seven Seals prophecy to do with the book of Revelation. If we can remember from last time, we've gone through some of the trumpets. We're in the trumpets area here. There's about approximately 21 different visions in the book of Revelation there, corresponding to different eras and the time of the Roman Empire and papal Europe. So we went through the first four trumpets. They were to do with the fall of the Western Empire of Rome. And now we're going through the fifth and the sixth trumpets. We went through the fifth one last time. Again, this is things that are happening on the Eastern Empire and bringing it to a close. So we saw last time the fifth trumpet was about the rise from about 600 AD of the Saracen Empire and the Islamic religion from the time of Muhammad. And we're going to look at today that became a great empire that pretty much dominated almost two-thirds, really, of the old Roman Empire area. And looked like it could have swept right across Western Europe, but didn't quite get there, according to the prophecy. But then after that, we find that there was another Islamic empire, or a couple of Islamic empires that arose, and they were the empires of the Turks, very long-lasting empires. And so that's one of the subjects of the sixth trumpet. Now you find in each of the sixth seal, the sixth trumpet, and the sixth vial in the book of Revelation that there tends to be two visions, and they tend to be associated with, if you like, spiritual, religious aspects. So the first one we're going to be looking at today is the first vision, the primary vision in the sixth trumpet. So again, you've seen some of these slides for those that have been around, but again, just reminding ourselves. So we're in this particular era here, which is, well, the Bible prophesied was going to be a very dangerous time, probably the worst time the world has ever seen, as far as the empires of this world allying themselves or arraigning themselves against the kingdom of God. And so we're going to be we looked at the Saracen Empire and how that for about 150 years that really sort of was very aggressive, and then that sort of tapered off. Then we're going to be looking at the Turkish empires, which brought to an end the Eastern Roman Empire with the taking of Constantinople as part of the subject we'll be looking at. And we find that continues. The Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, continued right through to the 20th century. And so that's sort of bringing us up, by the time we get to the end of this trumpet, up more to our modern times. And of course, then other things begin to happen in Europe. So again, we've seen the fall of the Western Empire and the first four trumpets. We're now looking at the fall of the Eastern Empire of Rome in the fifth and sixth trumpets. And today, looking at the sixth. So again, we've looked at the Saracens, the rise of Islam. We're now looking at the Turks and the fall of the Eastern Empire. So before we went into the fifth trumpet, we mentioned that these last three trumpets in the book of Revelation are called the woe trumpets. And they were particularly to be the really bad part of the whole book of Revelation, the things that were going to happen there. Particularly as far as the church was concerned and as far as natural Israel was concerned, this era was going to be the dominant part of the gospel age, and it was going to be the part dominated by the two apostasies in the west and in the east, one under the papacy and one under Islam. And so that's what we've been looking at. So today we're looking at the vision of the horses, or the great vast army of horses with heads like lions and belching fire and brimstone out of their mouths. So after that, we're going to look at, that's the first vision in the sixth trumpet. Then there's a second vision that has to do with the Reformation. So again, the different things that are pictured there. The army of horsemen is the one that we're looking at today. Again, representing the Turkish empires. So here we go. All right, sixth trumpet. So we read, one woe is past. So we've seen the first woe was the rise of Islam and the Arabian Empire. And behold, there come two woes more hereafter. And the sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar, which is before God, saying to the sixth angel which had the trumpet, loose the four angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. So this one again is a bit of a longer, there's a number of verses involved in this particular prophecy. And that, like the previous one, it's got quite a few similarities to the previous one. And we would expect that because they're both talking about great Islamic empires. And again, they're a bit more extended than the ones before them because they cover more of an extended time frame as well. So some of these phrases here, which I've highlighted, you might want to try to remember them. We'll mention them again later on, but they're some of these significant things we're going to be looking at. It mentions here that the sixth angel sounded his trumpet, and John then heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar, which is before God. And the particular altar that it's talking about there is the altar of incense. And the altar of incense represents the prayer and the worship of the saints being offered up to God. There's also on that altar, the blood of the sacrifice was sprinkled upon the four horns of the altar. So it has to do with sanctification, it has to do with the Lord's sacrifice, and it has to do with the purity of the worship that comes up from the church. And that's really what that part of the temple represents, and that's what it's all about. Usually they would offer up the incense upon the altar, and that was just before they go into the Holy of Holies. So it's interesting that the voice that was heard about this, loosing the four angels of destruction, that came from this particular altar. And it sort of gives us a little bit of an indication that what is about to happen is because of corrupt worship. And at this particular time in history, we find that both in the western side, we had the papacy and the Catholic system, and that had gotten into idolatry and worship of Mary and worship of the saints. But also on the eastern side, which we're about to look at, the old Eastern Roman Empire, which was by now what we'd call the Greek Orthodox Church, and some of the Orthodox churches in those areas there, they had also fallen into idolatry. Now, under the previous trumpet, when the Saracens looked like they were going to sweep around from both sides and overtake Europe completely, just before that really happened, trying to remember the date now, I think it was about 755, around about that date, the Greek, well, not the Greek, but the Greek side of things, the eastern side of things, the Greek Orthodox Church, I suppose, they had decided that the whole idea of idolatry and worshipping Mary and the saints and icons and these sorts of things, there was a king that arose who decided, no, that was completely wrong. And he made a real stand against what was happening in the West. And as a result, it's interesting that at that time, that was where the Saracens tried to attack Constantinople to finish off the Eastern Roman Empire, and they were not able to defeat it. And after that, just a year or so after that, they withdrew to Baghdad and basically ceased to be an aggressive force. And it's almost as though, because they made the right step in going against idolatry, that the Lord spared them for a time. Unfortunately, if you read the history, the queen at the time, or the queen that arose afterward, she was really into icons and idols, a bit like Jezebel under the Old Testament, and she encouraged them to go back in. And so they ended up, over time, they drifted back into the same trouble, into the same beliefs as the papacy was doing in the East. So they got back into idolatry. And then we find this new power arises, and this power finishes them off. And there is a lesson at the end of this prophecy, as we'll see here, on that particular subject. So the thought the voice comes from this altar of incense is maybe indicating that there is, if you like, God's voice from the pure worship side of things, he is angry with what is happening. So he says, loose the 4 angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. So the area that we're going to be looking at is the area around the Euphrates, because that's where this new power springs up. And previously, before the first four trumpets, we see there was a passage there that talked about the Lord said to the 4 angels which stood on the 4 corners of the earth and held back the storm. And then the Lord said, don't let the storm go. Don't hurt anybody until we have sealed our servants. And it would appear that these same 4 angels have, in a sense, been, wreaked their destruction over the Western Empire, and then around in the Eastern Empire, and then they have sort of come to a halt, if you like, in the area of the River Euphrates, which was where Baghdad was, the city was set up by the Saracens. They built this new city called Baghdad on the banks of Euphrates, and they then sort of retired there and ceased to be aggressive to Europe. So then says, and the 4 angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year. So this particular time frame, it indicates that they were prepared over this period of time, which is a prophetic period of time, and we will look at that later in the prophecy, over some hundreds of years, and is what it turns out to be. And they then destroyed at that time, after that time of preparation, they then destroyed Constantinople and brought the Eastern Empire to a close. So it says they were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year for to slay the 3rd part of men. So again, if you can remember, in the previous trumpets, we saw there that first the western third, it talked about the 3rd part was of the rivers, and the 3rd part of the land, and 3rd part of the sea, all referring to the western third, which was destroyed. In this case, it's talking about the eastern third, which is the old Eastern Roman Empire. So we read there, and the number of the army of the horsemen were 200,000. So the first thing we see is it gives us the impression of a great army of horsemen. The previous trumpet talked about a great army of locusts, which looked like horses and were geared together like horses for the battle. And that was significant because the Arabian and the Saracens, the armies and their empire, it was a time where the horses, and particularly horses coming from Arabia, sort of their home country, if you like, that again, it was a great army of horsemen. So this is also going to be a great army, typified by the horsemen there and the horses. It says that there were 200,000 or 200 million. In the Greek, it actually says 2 myriads of myriads. So a myriad is a number that can be used sometimes just in a general sense for an immense number, or it can be used specifically for 10,000. Okay, so that would be 10,000 times 10,000 and 2 lots of that. Now, one of the reasons that it may just say 2 myriads of myriads, or 2 great hordes, if you like, is that there were actually 2, should we say 2 actually Turkish empires. One was called the Seljuk Empire, which started, and then that was taken over by the Ottomans, and that became the one that lasted longer and went right through to the First World War. So basically we're seeing possibly it could be indicating 2 great hordes of horsemen and armies. Now, in the time that this actually began to happen, which, as we'll see, was around about 1000 AD, that the Turkish empires arose. During this time, and for those hundreds of years afterwards, was the time where cavalry was the dominant sort of force in warfare. And so that sort of fits very well with this particular time. So it says that John, he heard this great number, and it says, and I heard the number of them. So he heard the report of this vast number of horses and horsemen in this great army. And that sort of indicates that it was a famous thing. It was well known. He heard the report of it. It was something either boasted or it was, it was well known, infamous sort of a thing, if you like. And he heard the number of them. He said, "And thus I saw the horses in the vision, and them that sat on them, having breastplates of fire and of jacinth and brimstone." Now, this is something that appears almost 3 times in this particular vision, so it's very important. So they had breastplates which in colour looked like fire, and jacinth, which is a stone, which is a bluish purple sort of a stone. Also, I think it's the Greek word comes from this for hyacinth, which is a flower. Not that I know much about flowers, but I have to ask Julie about that. But again, I believe it's a purpley bluish sort of a flower as well. And brimstone, which is sulphur, which if you remember your science class is yellow. So we've got red and a bluish purple and a yellow. And it says the heads of the horses were as the heads of lions. So this wasn't any ordinary horses we saw in the vision here, but they had heads like lions, which indicates maybe a regal bearing to them, but also a ferocity, quite savage, being like lions and very warlike as well. And it says, "And out of their mouths issued fire and smoke and brimstone." Now it's interesting, this fire and smoke and brimstone is again similar sort of colours. We've got the fire and the fire, obviously, and the brimstone go together. And the smoke can often, of course, be a bluey grey type looking smoke, depending on the type of gunpowder, I suppose, that's being used. So this vast army that he saw there, and again, this is symbolic. We're not actually looking for real horses that have lions' heads and are breathing out fire and brimstone. But this is an indication of the sort of power of this army. So it says, "By these three," that's the fire and the smoke and the brimstone, "was the third part of men killed, by the fire and by the smoke and the brimstone which issued out of their mouths." Now, it's going to be very interesting because these particular things which are mentioned obviously emphasise quite a bit here. This was the time when they began to use gunpowder and cannons, particularly in their battles against fortified cities. And that's how they actually took Constantinople, which was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, and finished it off. The only way that anybody had been able to do that was when they were able to build these big cannons for the first time and use this new technology of gunpowder and blow apart the walls so that they could actually get up into the place, because it was an extremely fortified, well-fortified place, as we will see later on. So that played a great part in the destruction of the third part of the Roman Empire. It says, "For their power is in their mouth and in their tails. For their tails were like unto serpents, and they had heads, and with them they do hurt." Now, if you remember the previous one, the previous trumpet, again talking about the Arabians, the Islamic empire there, a very similar sort of thing. The horse-like locusts had tails, and they had scorpion tails, and it says, "With them they did hurt," sort of again indicating that they would not only be an aggressive force, but also behind them they would leave trouble and they would leave affliction. And again, something that was poisonous, serpents, scorpions, and it says, "With them they do hurt." And again, because they brought into the lands that they conquered the Quran and the teaching of Islam, and these things, they really oppressed the people who didn't believe in those things. And sometimes it was a case of, you either submit to the Quran or to the sword or to the tribute. So you either had to pay heavy taxes, or you convert, or you get put to death. So there was a lot of oppression that went after the battles, if you like, as they occupied these places. And it says, "And the rest of the men which were not killed by these plagues, yet repented not of the works of their hands, that they should not worship devils and idols of gold and silver and brass and stone and of wood, which neither can see nor hear nor walk. And neither repented they of their murders, nor of their sorceries, nor of their fornication, nor of their thefts." Now, the point being here that it's indicating that this third part of men died because they were involved in these things. They were involved in idolatry, they were involved in the immorality, they were involved in, as it says, their sorceries and their other ideas which were not of the Word of God. But it says that there's also another group of people who should see this and take note of the fact that this area, if you like, was destroyed. And of course, what we have at this time in the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire, both sides, whether it was the papacy, the Catholic system, or the Greek Orthodox system, they were both involved in idolatry. So the one perished because of that, and the Lord is saying, okay, so these people perished because of that, so the other side should take note. Unfortunately, as we go on to see, they didn't take note either. So there's the basic prophecy. This one we're only going to be able to do in 2 or 3 parts, so we won't be able to go through the whole thing today. But we'll go through maybe about half of it today, or a little bit less than that. We'll see how we go. So this was the situation after the Western Empire collapsed and turned into the nations of Europe, and that was all broken up into the situation that we know these days. So the Eastern Empire at that time, around about 527 to 565, was this area here, which is marked in the pink. Now the capital is Constantinople. It's actually on the Greek side here. There's the sea goes through here. It's about less than a kilometre wide at the narrowest point, and about 3 kilometres wide at the widest point. But that water, that's the Black Sea there, and of course that comes into the Mediterranean. And so it's quite a strategic point there. And Constantine, the Roman emperor, he was the one that built Constantinople. That's why it's named after him. And he shifted the emperors of Rome to Constantinople. And so that's where the emperors were living and ruling from at the time that these things were happening. So this was the Eastern Roman Empire, and that's how it was at the time of the breakup of the Western Empire. Now, around about that time, there was an emperor named Justinian. He was quite a strong emperor, and he sort of made some moves to retake parts of the Western Empire again. And for a short time in his lifetime, he did manage to get some control over parts of the Western Empire again. But again, it didn't last very long. And with his death, things collapsed again. And the Western Empire and the Eastern Empire were completely separate once more. So as we saw in the last trumpet, we saw from the Arabian Peninsula, we had Islam arise, and Muhammad and his Arabians then went out, and they crossed over right up into Spain and right over to India, and they took over a very large area. So that was the state of things, and that was the state there of the Eastern Roman Empire at the time that happened. And then after about 150 years of expanding to that particular size, they then had some troubles within themselves, and they had a split, which is where the Sunni and Shia split comes from in Islam. And they went back and they established Baghdad. They built Baghdad on the Euphrates River in 762, and they ceased to be aggressive. But they stayed a big power for quite a while. Over time, though, they broke up into different caliphates. So they had different caliphs in charge of different areas. And again, it wasn't just one united group. And they began to have troubles between themselves. And so the whole thing began to weaken and to wane. And we have in Egypt and over in the Baghdad area, particularly those two caliphs were quite sort of strongly against each other. And it was weakening the whole system. So they weren't really a threat to Europe at this time, but again, the whole system was weakening here. Now you can see, we're just going to focus on what happened here, because the scripture says that the 4 angels of destruction were going to be loosed from the Euphrates. So this is the river Euphrates here, going from the Persian Gulf up into what we now call Turkey, and Baghdad on the banks there. So in around about 1055, they were becoming sort of fairly soft, and the whole thing was weakening quite a bit. But there was another people who lived up around, this is the Caspian Sea here, and up around this area and out in that direction were the Turks. And their peoples, they were again, horsemen, and they were very, very numerous. And they began to come into this area, and they began to be employed as mercenaries and into the armies there of the Arabian Empire and the Saracens. And so the Caliph who was in Baghdad, he started to have some contact with these people, and he actually allied with one of them, a man by the name of Toghrul Beg. And this man came into Baghdad, and the Turks began to convert to Islam. And so all of a sudden you've got all these hordes of people who are converting to Islam and sort of allying themselves with the Saracens. And so the Saracen Caliph here in Baghdad, he got this man Toghrul Beg. He gave him his daughter to marry, so they intermarried there to form a connection. And this Turk, Toghrul Beg, he stayed in Baghdad for about a year, and then he went out. He was named defender of the Islamic faith, basically, and he, on behalf of the Caliph, went out and began to subdue this area again. So again, it started from right there on the Euphrates, and he went out and began to spread in this direction. For a while, they didn't go past the Euphrates, and I think it was in 1063 that his successor, Toghrul Beg's successor, whose name will come up in a moment, I think it was something like Alp Arslan, he then decided to attack the Eastern Empire, and he crossed the Euphrates. And it's sort of at this time that probably the prophecy really comes into effect as he crossed the Euphrates at the head of hordes of cavalry, and he attacked the Eastern Empire and fairly quickly subdued things over in what we used to call Asia Minor, or Turkey now. So the Seljuk Empire spread out quite rapidly. But then as time went on, because they did, if we can just go back to the previous one, because they started to spread quite rapidly and take over part of the Eastern Empire, Europe became quite alarmed at what was happening there. And this was the time of the Crusades. So they began to send the Crusades against the Seljuk Turks and against the Saracens that were still in these areas. And we had the various crusades going on there. At the same time that was happening, from the east, there was a growing another empire, one of the greatest empires, or largest empires that has ever been, and that was the Mongol Empire. And they came in and they began to take over the Turkish areas. And it got to the point where the Seljuk Turks were just pretty much left to this spot here. The Mongols had come in and dominated this area, and they were pretty much under domination of the Mongols at this particular time. But what happened was there was a tribe of the Turks called the Ottomans, and this was right on the border of the Eastern Roman Empire at the time and the Turkish Empire, and they then began to grow and to take power, and they took over from the Seljuks. And they started up another Turkish empire, Islamic, which then dominated this whole area. So they began to grow. They took over the side of the Eastern Roman Empire on this side of the strait. And all the time on this side and Europe's side, we find that the nations that had been forming over here all began to also wear down what was left of the Eastern Roman Empire, which was called the Byzantine Empire at the time. So that was reducing all the time and getting smaller and smaller. So then the Ottoman Empire took over everything, the old Eastern Roman Empire, just except pretty much the city of Constantinople, which again was very heavily fortified and very difficult to take, and that existed for a bit longer. So this takes us up to about 1451, and in 1453 the Sultan, the Turkish Sultan that was around at the time, Mehmet II, he decided he was going to take Constantinople, and so he prepared a lot, and he built up a great army, and he came against the city to finish it off. So, as you can see, looking at it a little bit closer there, you can't see it all that well, but there is a patch of water. This is a strait of water. So Constantinople is on this side. And again, it's quite heavily defended. It's pretty much a little peninsula, as you'll see in the next slide. And this is the Bosphorus. I think that's how you pronounce it. And this is the little Horn Peninsula here, where the city of Constantinople is. Today it's called Istanbul because it was taken over by the Ottoman Empire and given an Islamic name. So that is the situation of Constantinople. So got a little quote here about when Mehmet actually took the city. It says, later in the day, when the chaos had died down, there was a siege of about 53 days, and then they took the city. Later in the day, when the chaos had died down and some semblance of order had been restored, Mehmet made his own triumphant entry into Constantinople. According to legend, Mehmet stopped and gave thanks to God, and then he turned to congratulate his 70 or 80,000 Muslim heroes, crying out, "Halt not, conquerors! God be praised, you are the conquerors of Constantinople." It is the iconic moment at which he assumes the name by which he has always been known in Turkish, Fatih. I don't know if that's quite how you pronounce it, Fatih the Conqueror, and the instant at which the Ottoman Empire comes fully into its own. So this is where it had been going for a while, but this is its moment of fame. So from that point, they then still became a great threat to Europe for quite a long time. Again, as the scripture indicates, it was a woe trumpet. It was going to be a woe to the peoples around them. So it would be another 200 years before the advance of the Ottomans into Europe was definitely halted. In 1683, at the gates of Vienna. In the interval, Christianity and Islam would wage a long-running war, both hot and cold, that would linger long in the racial memory and that formed a long link in the chain of events between the two faiths. The Ottoman peril was seen as the continuation of the perceived assault of Islam on the Christian world. The word Turk replaced the word Saracen as the generic name or generic term for a Muslim, and with it came all the connotations of a cruel and implacable opponent. Again, they were halted at Venice, but had they overrun Venice, there would have been much to stop them probably taking over the whole area. So this is where they were when they took Constantinople, and then they began to spread out into the areas of Egypt and down into Arabia, taking over Mecca and Medina, where the whole thing, Islamic religion started. And then finally they spread out, took over the area of the Euphrates again. As I say, they got right up here, and that was the full extent there. So they came close to taking everywhere except Western Europe. So it was a mighty empire, and that was at its peak. It was around about 1683 at the time that they nearly took Vienna. So they continued after that to be quite a dominant power. In the 1800s, the mid-1800s, they started to have areas rebel against them, Egypt and other places, and eventually they, as the scriptures said, they would dry up. So there is the sixth vial, which is later on in the series of prophecies and revelation there, actually ends up talking about the fall or the drying up of this same power. But for the moment here, it's just talking about its rise and its dominance for quite some time. So, checking how the time is going, because I don't want to go too long tonight. Okay, so we'll see what the next slide is. All right, so I think we'll leave it at that point, and then we'll probably have to go through it in two parts still, because there's quite a bit of interesting history that goes with all of this, and the actual story of the siege of Constantinople and these sorts of things. But in the next set, we'll go through some of the symbols, talking about the horsemen and the vast numbers of the Turkish cavalry down throughout the generations. And then we'll go through all the other symbols that are mentioned there as well, and the time frame and that sort of thing. So, yeah, I think we will leave it at that for tonight.